Oh, dang, we're not playing anymore. There have been shots fired. Welcome back to History 1301, guys. Y'all know it's Professor Tatum here to guide you through yet another lecture. Here we're looking at the early battles, finally, of the American Revolution. Gonna look at a little common sense getting thrown into the patriots' heads that'll finally lead them to declare independence. About dang time. We've been waiting for this one. We'll look at a little bit of context as usual, and then we'll look at this shot heard around the world that started off the war. And then we'll look at the Second Continental Congress, look at a little bit of common sense, and the Declaration of Independence. So we need to remember that the First Continental Congress had met to discuss what to do about these changing British policies, and they could not come to a unified response. While they did collectively agree that they would consider the intolerable acts, as they called them, which were those coercive acts, null and void, they couldn't agree with much else. Remember, there was these factions developing between the patriots who supported the protests against the British government and changing policies, and then there were loyalists who didn't maybe care for some of the policies, but they thought the patriots were getting a little in over their heads, and they didn't really care for their tactics of protest. We do need to understand, though, the very few colonists by the time of the First Continental Congress were interested in independence. Only the most radical of the patriots were. Loyalists like Jonathan Sewell were certainly opposed to independence. So since there wasn't much agreed upon here, this First Continental Congress said, let's go ahead and table this. We'll meet again after a year, see where we're at, take things from there. In the meantime, the British government was pretty fed up with this protest movement that had been developing throughout the colonies, and they wanted to come in and crush the rebellion, take a more firm stance to remind them who was in charge. Let them know we really mean business. We're done playing games. No more rebellion. So, as part of their efforts to start crushing the rebellion, the British Army sent a battalion of soldiers to Massachusetts. The Patriots referred to these soldiers, by the way, as redcoats. Gee, I wonder why. Look at the picture there. But these redcoats were coming into Massachusetts with two goals. They were going to go to the town of Lexington to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were some prominent leaders of the Sons of Liberty. And they were also going to go to Concord, Massachusetts, and seize an arsenal of weapons. Now, before I go any further, I know there's going to be some Yankee in the class who's going to give me a hard time and say, it's Concord, not Concord. Well, okay, you say tomato all you want, bro. I'm still going to say tomato. But these soldiers were being watched. I always feel like somebody's watching me. Well, trust that feeling, because you got Paul Revere and his boys keeping a close eye on you. So there were a few patriots, including Paul Revere, who had been watching the British Army and knew that they were heading out toward Lexington and Concord. So they started heading out to the colonies to inform them that the army was on the way. Now, I'm sure a lot of us have probably heard legends of Paul Revere taking his midnight ride, coming into the towns to yell that the British are coming, the British are coming, so valiantly warning them so they could prepare for battle. Well, that's of course a bit simplified to make the legend sound nice and pretty and to create a single hero. Paul Revere was one of the few individuals who were doing this. He wasn't alone. And he actually didn't even make it to his final destination. He ended up getting captured and detained by British authorities. So he didn't make it to the final destination some of these other guys had to. And it's also very unlikely that any of these people who were alerting the colonists of the approaching British army were saying, the British are coming. Because we got to remember, at this time, they have not declared independence. Not many of them are interested in independence. So they still consider themselves to be British. While they are in rebellion, they are still subjects of the British Empire. And they certainly see themselves as such. As we'll see, it's going to take them a long time to get over that. But from people like Paul Revere coming in and warning them that the Redcoats were on the way, that's more likely what they said, by the way, the Redcoats are coming, something along those lines. They were able to, though, to get John Hancock and Sam Adams out of town before the soldiers arrived, and they were also able to remove several of their weapons from their arsenal before the army could come and confiscate them. So by the time the soldiers arrived in Lexington, they were met by members of the Massachusetts militia, known as Minutemen. So these Minutemen were individuals who had to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. And they waited there with their guns drawn, and here come the Redcoats, and they had a standoff, pointing their guns at each other, and each side refused to shoot. And then, according to legend, there was this shot heard round the world. This mysterious shot that just rang out. Nobody knows where it came from. It could have been from a British soldier. It could have been a misfire from the Patriots. It could have been a fire from a house nearby. You got to love these kinds of stories because they make the battle that follows almost inevitable. Okay, there's a shot. Nobody knows who fired it. You don't know if you're being shot at, so you have to fight. It's inevitable at that point. Well, those of you who've had a 1302 class with me, you're going to hear a familiar spiel here to something you've already heard, so bear with me. But I always like to share when we come across these kinds of things that I am fascinated by organized crime. That's kind of my side thing that I get turned into, go into rabbit holes down in addition to history. So I watched all kinds of documentaries about the mafia and read all kinds of books and read articles about different organized crime groups. And I have never come across a story where criminals had a dispute that started because a gun just mysteriously went off. Yet we do have a few episodes of that in American history, okay? And these stories, I've noticed, always strangely enough, involve either the US military or an American militia, like we see here. Isn't that strange? That only when there's the US military or an American militia involved is there this shot that just rings out mysteriously and causing everybody to have to go to battle. Y'all think about that one for a while. Anyway, these Minutemen did put up a good fight. They did take some of the Redcoats down with them, but they realized they were outmatched here, and they made the smart choice and eventually retreated. The Redcoats from there continued their march on to Concord, not realizing that the weapon arsenal had been mostly emptied. They headed there. They were pretty dang disappointed when they arrived and found that most of the arsenal had already been removed. But they went and blocked off the bridge nearby that led into the city. And as they were waiting there at that bridge, some Minutemen came in trying to storm into Concord. And the two sides had a battle. And in this battle, here at Concord, the Minutemen were more prepared, and they managed to do some serious damage to the Redcoats there. And the Redcoats made the decision to retreat. So what the heck just happened here? Guys, we just witnessed the first battle of the American Revolution. Okay, this battle of Lexington and Concord. They're technically two separate battles, but they happen on the same day. They're closely interlinked. So let's think of them as one battle. All right, most historians do. And if we consider what happened here from the Redcoats' point of view, they retreated from Concord because this kind of wasn't really worth their time. All right. They said, well, the guys we came to capture are gone. The weapons we came to seize are mostly gone. This is not worth sitting here and losing lives over. Let's leave for now and we'll get them when we're ready. And it's worth fighting, in our opinion. But from the Patriots' point of view, we got to consider here. This is a militia. These are civilians who take on military duties as necessary. And they've managed to send soldiers from the most powerful, professional, well-trained army in the world fleeing off into the woods. You can only imagine the exhilaration they must have felt as just a militia sending these soldiers, these professional, well-trained soldiers running for their skin. And they went chasing after them, and they yelled at them, and they kept firing. Because from their point of view, this was a major victory, okay? And this would certainly boost their morale moving forward. Of course, though, to the Redcoats, it's like, okay, guys, y'all aren't worth our time. We're getting out of here. This, guys, though, was, again, the first shots of the American Revolution. That's pretty historically significant, is it not? From here, there's no turning back. They are all in. They have now committed treason against the British government. They have killed soldiers from the British Army. This is it. So you'd think at this point, okay, they fired on the British Army. There's clearly no turning back. They're going to declare independence now, right? No. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, they still refused to declare independence. There was even another battle a few months later, known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. So in this battle, some of the Patriot militiamen tried to surround the city of Boston, where there were a lot of Redcoats stationed. They were going to try to trap them in there and force them to surrender. But they kind of underestimated how much they were outnumbered by the Redcoats. And the Redcoats ended up coming out and forcing them to retreat. They went and retreated up this big hill nearby, known as Breed's Hill. Now, there's another hill nearby named Bunker Hill. So this battle, which was fought on Breed's Hill, was incorrectly recorded as being fought on Bunker Hill, and that name's just kind of stuck. Oops, we called it the wrong thing. Kind of like the 7 Years' War, which was actually 9 years. Historians, I swear, we need to get better at naming things. Anyway, this Battle of Bunker Hill, which was actually fought on Breeds Hill, we got to keep in mind now the Patriots are up this hill, and the British Redcoats are having to charge up the hill to fight them. Now, as I've suggested before, military history is not really my forte. I am no military expert by any means, but I don't think it takes much common sense to understand that charging uphill is something you want to avoid if at all possible. You got gravity going against you. One guy falls, everybody go falling like dominoes. You got to shoot uphill. Again, gravity coming into play there. Your bullets are probably not going to go where you want them to. But despite having this disadvantage of having to charge uphill, the British soldiers were, again, much better trained and had far more numbers, and they managed to get a victory in this battle. But it was a very costly battle for them. I, of course, never care that you know specific numbers, but we can see that the Patriots lost somewhere around 450 men in this battle. Those are casualties, actually. That includes killed, wounded, and missing. While the British had over 1,000 casualties in this battle. So for the Patriots, even though they lost this battle, that's going to help boost their morale. Now they have at one point managed to send the British Army fleeing. They have also managed to do a lot of damage to the British. Even if they lost the battle, they managed to give them over 1,000 casualties. This also, though, would lead the Patriots to realize that they perhaps needed to get a bit more organized and a bit more well-trained and have a professional army. A lot of people were somewhat skeptical of that because of, again, their history with Oliver Cromwell and the military dictatorship after the English Civil War. But they're starting to think more in the line of, if we really want to face off against this professional army, we'd be a lot better suited if we had a professional army as well. The British, they're starting to realize these Patriots are no joke, okay? We're not dealing with a few little rebels dressing up like Indians throwing crates off of ships anymore. We are now dealing with people who are ready to fight and willing to die if necessary. And we need to take this a lot more seriously, and we need to be ready for war. Again, now, we've had 2 big battles, over 1,000 British casualties at this point. There is clearly no turning back from this. So you'd think the colonists are going to come together and agree that it's time to declare independence, right? Still not doing so at this point. They still refuse to declare independence. In fact, when the Second Continental Congress met, they made a final appeal to the King of England to try to make peace. They wrote to the King of England this letter known as the Olive Branch Petition. So an olive branch is a metaphor for peace, okay? If somebody hands somebody an olive branch, that's a symbolic way of saying, I would like to make peace with you. So they're writing this letter to King George, trying this one last chance at having peace. And in this letter, they basically pledge their loyalty to King George, saying, look, I know we've had some conflict back and forth, but our problems are not with you. Our problems are with Parliament. They're the ones who've caused all this trouble. So if you can talk some sense into them and you're willing to work with us, I think we still have a shot of existing peacefully. Now, we're going to want some changes, but we can definitely make peace if you're willing to hear us out. Basically, what they're trying to do here is play their 2 parents against each other, right? They've got the monarchy, and then there's the representative body of government and parliament. They're trying to play one side against the other, hoping that they can use that to their advantage. But the king didn't go for this, okay? He refused to even officially recognize this olive branch petition, meaning he probably didn't even actually take the time to read the full thing. And what he did once he received this is he declared the colonies to be in an official state of rebellion. Funnily enough, as the Second Continental Congress was writing this olive branch petition and suing for peace, they were also organizing their Continental Army. So they did decide on making this professional army, this well-trained army to face off against the British. So on one hand, they're asking for peace, but they're simultaneously preparing for war. All right, I guess they're kind of hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst, which really, in a lot of cases, isn't a bad strategy. And as they're trying to figure out who was going to lead this army, this Continental Army they were creating, they all kind of looked around at the delegates at the table, And there was really not a whole lot of question of who it was going to be. Because somewhere along that table was this tall Virginian man in a military officer's uniform. And that was George Washington. Remember, George Washington had been a military commander during the French and Indian War, which was the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, and he came in his military uniform. He was tall and commanding. He just had this air about him as a leader, and people looked at him and said, "This is clearly the guy we need to lead our Continental Army." So they picked him to be the commander of the Continental Army. And I think we can learn here from old George Washington that it never hurts to dress for the job you want. It can certainly work to your advantage in some cases. But again, even here at the Second Continental Congress, as they're organizing this professional army, this Continental Congress is still not being able to get enough people on board with the idea of independence to make it happen. So they said, okay. We've agreed on some things here. Not doing the independence thing right now. Let's meet again in a year and see where we're at. Recognizing the pattern here. I do want to give you guys a heads up that I know we started with the First Continental Congress, and they said we'll meet again in a year. Now that we're at the second meeting, we're calling this the Second Continental Congress. Heads up. Very confusing, I know. I didn't pick this. It's just the way it is. When they meet again for the third time, they're still going to be referred to as the Second Continental Congress. So both the second and third meeting are the Second Continental Congress. Why is it that so many people at this point are so hesitant to declare independence? I think there's a lot of things we can consider here. If we think of what people like Jonathan Sewell were saying, there's a big argument that the British have this powerful army that can provide a sense of defense, right? There's definitely a bit of military security there. Furthermore, they could perhaps continue to have a sense of economic security under the British Empire. Now, at this point, though, those things are seeming like they're not quite the case. They are raising up an army to fight against the British Army, not looking so much like they're going to be able to enjoy those benefits at this point. So, what else might be keeping them tied to the British Empire and making them refuse to declare independence? To me, what I see as the kind of strongest link is their devotion to their British identity. Okay, we see this playing out throughout British history. Remember the Puritans and separatists, the Pilgrims, as we call them, who had left England to escape religious persecution, first went to the Netherlands. But remember, they left the Netherlands and came on the Mayflower to North America because they felt that in the Netherlands they might lose their British identity. So they wanted to come to the Americas where they already had fellow Englishmen so that they would maintain their at that time English, I should say, identity. I also, when we were examining all the colonies and looking at how distinct they all were, pointed out that the one thing that was really tying them all together was, despite whatever ethnicity they may be, all people throughout these colonies considered themselves subjects of the British Empire. And they all did seem to have some kind of sense of pride in being British. So it seems to me that that's kind of the strongest thing keeping them from declaring independence, even at this point where they're quite literally now at war with the British Army. And it seems like they needed somebody to just come by and talk some sense into them. And that's where this guy, Thomas Paine, came in. So Thomas Paine hadn't been in the colonies long by the time he wrote Common Sense. He came here essentially because he had failed at just about everything he tried back in England. Right, he tried following in his father's footsteps as a tailor, a corset maker, particularly. Didn't do too hot at that. He tried writing a little bit, mildly successful at that. But basically, everything in his life seemed like it wasn't really going anywhere. And that's, for the most part, why he came to the American colonies. And when he got here, he kind of looked around at this political situation and he said, somebody needs to speak up here, because it is just plain common sense what people need to do here. And he wrote this in very plain English that appealed directly to common people and argued, guys, it is only common sense that we need to declare independence. He said, you guys are literally at war with the British Empire. I haven't been here that long, but it's very plain for me to see what you guys have done here is something that can't be taken back. So stop playing games. Get to the point. Declare independence. And he kind of rebutted a lot of arguments against independence. He said, some people will say that the British Empire brings us military protections. But let's think about it. All the conflicts we've had have been because of wars that they're in, that they get us caught up in, right? It's kind of their imperial conflicts that have caused us trouble. And he says, oh, other people will complain that we're going to struggle economically if we don't have trade with our mother country. Guys, there's other countries in the world we can trade with. We'll be okay. Furthermore, we have an abundance of resources here. We can make our own stuff too. We don't have to be so tied to the British. Use your head, people. This is common sense. We need to declare independence. This thing went viral, and it was very successful. Okay, it really got the message across. And I'm going to argue that it was more than anything common sense that led to the colonists finally deciding to declare independence. So once that Second Continental Congress met again in the summer of 1776, that pamphlet, Common Sense, it's written by Thomas Paine, had circulated throughout the colonies and had become very popular. And enough of these individuals here at the Congress seemed to say, well, this guy has a point. Who are we kidding, guys? This is what we have to do. And that Second Continental Congress did declare independence. Declaration of Independence, this document, very important document, clearly shows us some things about writing. This was written by a 5-man committee. I have all the individuals here, but the primary author I want us to understand was Thomas Jefferson. Now, please don't mix this up with the U.S. Constitution. They are two very different documents. And as educated individuals, we need to understand that the Declaration of Independence does not equal the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution does not equal the Declaration of Independence. No. Furthermore, by that standard, Thomas Jefferson is not the author of the U.S. Constitution. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. Get that straight, take note of it, highlight it. This document, though, that created an independent nation that had broken away from the British Empire, took several drafts, all right, and was edited several times. Thomas Jefferson would write it, pass it along to these other guys, and they would scratch parts out and say, what the hell does this say? You spelled this word wrong. Dude, what are you getting at here? Don't you think maybe we could say this differently here and that way? And they all worked together to create a better piece of writing. All right. So even this very important piece of writing here, written by people who clearly knew what they were doing, took a lot of time, okay, and a lot of patience. But it made some things happen. Right? Did it not? This created a new nation independent of the powerful empire that they were breaking away from. Not only that, that kind of set a precedent for other colonies around the world to do similar types of things. We'll talk about that a little more moving forward. But this piece of writing here, this declaration, was brought before the Second Continental Congress in its final draft form in July 2nd, 1776. 2 days later, July 4th, they officially adopted this Declaration of Independence, making it clear that they were on board with declaring independence from Britain. Now, even though that's the day we celebrate, as the date of the Declaration of Independence. By the way, if you ever wonder why you get hot dogs, firework, and maybe those of you who are 21 and up, of course, only beer on the 4th of July, well, you may think you're celebrating my birthday because it's July 3rd. We're just still partying into the next day, but you'd be wrong. We're doing that because we're honoring the Declaration of Independence, okay? However, it was not signed on that day. Nobody actually put their John Hancock onto this document until August 2nd. And from there, it was even quite some time as people were adding signatures to this thing before it was finally signed by everybody who was on board with it. So it was a very gradual process, even in the signing of the thing. So what did this Declaration of Independence do? It called for 13 independent United States. Now notice here the way I've capitalized states but not united. That's the way you'll see it frequently written in early documentation, because that's the way they viewed it, all right? They placed more emphasis on the states than unity. They were independent states. We need to understand that in other parts of the world, The word state is usually used much differently than the way we use it here in the United States, all right? We use states to kind of refer to provinces essentially within a nation, whereas in other parts of the world, state essentially refers to government or nation. So we can kind of think of this as creating 13 independent countries in a way who are loosely united together. I do want us to understand, however, moving forward with our class, and if you're writing about anything past this point, we're no longer talking about colonies, we're talking about states. We are no longer talking about colonists, we're talking about patriots or Americans. They have declared independence by this point. We need to recognize that independence. This Declaration of Independence also was clearly influenced by John Locke. Okay, these liberal ideas that had been driving these protest movements were very clearly reflected in the Declaration of Independence. We can look at some examples. So this liberal concept advocated by John Locke of natural rights is very clearly manifested in the Declaration of Independence. Very first line, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're natural. All right. And they say that all men have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, of course, John Locke was calling for natural rights of life, liberty, and property, but Thomas Jefferson and his co authors decided they wanted to fluff it up a little bit, and they thought it'd be a better sell if they said something nice and pretty like the pursuit of happiness. But very clearly, direct influence from John Locke at play there. Now, I'm not going to read through the rest of these, but you can see here there are passages within the Declaration of Independence very clearly reflecting things like that. Consent of the governed, which was key to John Locke's theories of liberalism. Also, that right to revolt, the right and duty of a people to revolt, and to either rebel against or overthrow, if necessary, a government that does not rule by consent or protect natural rights. Furthermore, something that we didn't get too into that John Locke stood firmly against was the idea of a divine right or hereditary authority, which had been the ways that the monarchy had operated in England. Okay, so early on, they operated under this idea of divine right, meaning that God had chosen this person to rule over England, and they had God's blessing to be the king, so nobody could question their authority. And from there, there's this hereditary rule of authority where the family of king are kind of automatically born into this status of royalty where they're automatically treated different and more powerful from all other men. And that's something that John Locke firmly opposed as part of his liberal thought. And it's absolutely something that was clearly reflected as well in the Declaration of Independence, with that principle of all men being created equal, showing that no man is granted authority from God or his bloodline. We're all born on an equal standing with a tabula rasa, or blank slate, as John Locke called it, and we have to earn our way to any level of authority, right? And if we get a level of authority, of course, it must be based on the consent of the governed, and we must use that authority to help protect natural rights. So what can we learn from this guy, Thomas Paine, here? Very clearly, his writings led directly to the Declaration of Independence, right? So he has some things that we should be looking out for. But the guy seemed to be failure for the most part by the time he got here to North America, right? He hadn't made it in his job. He couldn't really impress anybody. Everything kind of fell apart over there. And he came here to try to start afresh. Well, this lets us see that we can kind of start from wherever we are. That we don't have to be so caught up in, nothing's gone right for me up to this point. I was dealt a bad hand, or I made all these mistakes, or I haven't been the best person, or maybe I didn't take school as seriously as I should have, or I went and got myself fired from this job, or I broke up with this person and I should have stayed with them, or whatever. We are where we are, guys. Are we going to sit here and keep clinging to the past? Or are we, like Thomas Paine, going to use our common sense to say, I can make a difference here and do what needs to be done and help others grasp the level of common sense that I'm seeing that they're missing, right? So we can certainly see that no matter what situations we come from, we can use what we have to make something, all right? If we see something that needs to be said, we can say it. If we see something that needs to be done, we can do it. And we can take whatever skills we have to use them, right? He wasn't writing in big flowery language. He's using very common basic language to appeal to the people around him. We can see here the good writing, all right, that has gone through a process of revision and has been given the proper amount of time that good writing takes can certainly make things happen. I'm gonna get up a soapbox now. I get pretty fired up over all this. This whole thing is just phenomenal, right? We got again these colonies that had seemingly nothing in common now coming together and rebelling against the most powerful empire in the world to form an independent nation, largely based on the suggestions by a guy who could have easily said, "I'm not good enough. I can't do anything," but was brave enough to say, "You know what, guys? I'm gonna say it. It's just common sense." I'll go ahead and wrap it up there, guys. I know y'all probably heard enough for now. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, over and out.